Hello and welcome to the second campaign update video of our interactive wargame campaign, imagining what might have happened in the last Jacobite Rising of 1745 if some of the decisions had been taken a little bit differently. As usual, our decisions for the Jacobites have been taken on the Battle of Prestonpans Heritage Trust Facebook page, and our closed group of British Army reenactors have been determining how the British Army responds. Our campaign's been taking place in real time, but it's been a pretty busy few weeks as we've moved through October 1745, so we'd better fill you in on all of the action that's been taking place. Now, at the end of our last video, we left Bonnie Prince Charlie and his main Jacobite army laying siege to Edinburgh Castle. They didn't have the artillery to make much of an impression on the walls, but they did have time on their side and no British forces available to relieve the garrison. And according to the siege rules to which we're playing, over time that ticked things in favour of the Jacobite besiegers, and sure enough, after just over 3 weeks, the garrison was forced to capitulate. This was huge news, and the castle's fall also released some ordnance for the Jacobites to take to other strategic locations should they wish. We had a vote, therefore, amongst the Jacobite Council to decide whether or not the Jacobites should move their siege train into the north to deal with the Highland forts, look at Stirling Castle potentially, or even make this the opportunity to take the army into England, maybe to the walled towns of Newcastle or Carlisle. So, taking a quick look back at our simplified campaign map, we've turned the fortress of Edinburgh Castle blue to represent the Jacobites taking it, and the main field army there in the city waiting for its orders. Meanwhile, we've also got a number of other smaller forces operating in Scotland, Lord Lewis Gordon and a couple of lowland regiments in Aberdeen, and Tullibardine, whose forces were victorious in the Battle of 9 Mile Bridge, covered in the last video. They're sat there between Fort Augustus and Fort William. Up there at Fort George in Inverness, however, there is a Redcoat regiment, Loudon's Highland regiment, under the Earl of Loudon himself. So that's our situation as it stands. The Jacobites determined, however, that they were going to move the main body of the army to Stirling and lay siege to the castle. So the main Jacobite army moves to Stirling, and the surrender of the castle being refused by the garrison, they settle down for a long and potentially difficult siege. Meanwhile, the Duke of Argyll has begun raising the Argyll militia in his Clan Campbell territories in the west of Scotland, and those of you with keen eyes will have noticed the appearance of Marshal Wade's forces down there in central England. They're starting to assemble, ready for a move northwards that will threaten potentially the main Jacobite position at Edinburgh. Meanwhile, the Jacobite recruitment roll raised Cromarty's regiment in the north, and the determination roll suggested that Cromarty should move his regiment immediately down to Stirling to join the main army. So this blue line on the map indicates the route that Cromarty intended to take. But that route brought him straight past Fort George at Inverness, and the Earl of Loudon rolled to intercept that march. In fact, he took the entire garrison of Fort George, his full regiment, Loudon's Highlanders, and decided to face off with Cromarty one-on-one. And so, on the 16th of October 1745, our next field skirmish takes place that was fought on the tabletops here at the museum, a skirmish which we determined would be fought at Ardasier Kirk. So we determined the battle would probably take place somewhere around here, although this is Roy's military survey from about a decade after the battle, and this fortress that dominates the peninsula here was not there in 1745. There was a fishing village here called Blacktown. This is the replacement for the Fort George that's in central Inverness in 1745, and this is the one that's still there today. Now, because of the narrowness of the crossing point here, we decided that Cromarty would have attempted to get his men across by boat to avoid the Inverness garrison in this direction. The intercept roll determined that he would successfully get into position before Loudon could intercept him, and so we decided he'd be able to take up defensive positions ahead of Loudon's approach from the direction of Inverness. So, transferring that landscape onto the tabletop, we have here the coastal setting with the village of Blacktown at the top, the old kirk of Ardasier and its walled churchyard, in the centre, and the road from Inverness running from one side of the table to the other, the road on which the Earl of Loudon must approach the battlefield. Cromarty successfully gets his single regiment across the Firth and then deploys into Blacktown. And using the rules that we have for these small-scale actions, he's able to divide his single regiment into two sections and deploy them to advantage. He does so, placing one section in the enclosures in front of Blacktown village and the second section up in the walled churchyard at Ardasier Kirk. And this, in fact, created a field of fire, supporting fire, which created a killing zone on the road from Inverness. And here's Loudon bringing his regiment into the field, and after a successful order roll, dividing them into two sections so that he could match Cromarty's deployments. He moved the first towards Ardasier Kirk, taking care to skirt the edge of the musket range of the men in the village, and this proved to be a wise precaution because his second section failed its order roll, and so wasn't able to move up quickly enough to support, or at least to cover, the flank of the first section. Musketry erupts, of course, as they come into range, and Cromarty's men have the advantage of being behind that stone wall. And eventually, of course, the second section of Loudon's men moves up towards the village, and we end up with a pretty even firefight exchanged in two directions. However, on both fronts, Loudon's men are out in the open, firing against men who are behind stone walls. And so, to try and neutralise that, or at least gain a greater chance of inflicting casualties on the Jacobites, both of the sections of Loudon's men move forwards to within close range, and blistering musketry is exchanged across the battlefield. Soon, Loudon's men in front of Blacktown are suffering so many casualties that he decides to attempt to disengage. If he takes too many losses, he might not be able to hold Fort George in the campaign. But instead of withdrawing, he blunders the order, and in fact the section attempts to charge Cromarty behind the stone walls. The attack is a disaster, and the rout of his unit makes the battlefield a very dangerous place indeed for the survivors of Loudon's regiment. Loudon's remaining section, facing off the kirkyard, attempts to make a fighting withdrawal from the field, but now they're enfiladed by the successful defenders of Blacktown, and pushed by superior numbers, and having a succession of failed orders, eventually Loudon's section is obliged to surrender. And so, the entirety of Loudon's regiment is either destroyed or captured. Loudon himself is taken prisoner and released on parole, and of course, as a result, Fort George is impossible to hold. And so Cromarty, after a very successful engagement, is able to, instead of marching his force down to link up with the Prince at Stirling, turn to Inverness and force the small skeleton garrison left behind by Loudon to surrender. The capture of Inverness and Fort George is a significant coup for the Jacobites' army. Meanwhile, the Duke of Argyll in the west of Scotland has determined that in the wake of these Jacobite successes of recent times, is unable to make much of an impression in the Western Highlands, so he moves his militia down to Glasgow. There he is able to count on the zeal of the citizens and raise a full militia regiment of Blues and maybe make some mischief in the southwest of Scotland, threatening the Jacobite siege lines at Stirling. Naturally, the Jacobites aren't very keen on this, and there's a discussion amongst the Jacobite council and a vote taken, and it's determined that rather than weakening the lines at Stirling to deal with the problem at Glasgow, they would summon Tullibardine down from Tirnadrish and get him to clear Glasgow of the enemy. So Tullibardine marches down from the north towards Glasgow, and the determination roll for the Duke of Argyll insists that Argyll decides that it's worth holding the city and digging in to defend it. And so, on the 26th of October 1745, our campaign determines that there would have been a fairly large-scale skirmish at Glasgow's western approach. So we spent some time imagining what Glasgow might have appeared to look like in the mid-18th century, before a lot of the expansion that would happen in the subsequent decades, and how we might approach representing it on the tabletop. Now Argyll knew that the Jacobites were coming, and he was able to take up a defensive position in the city. He defended the western side, holding the end of the old Glasgow bridge, which still had its gate at this time. He had a barricade up at the old Watergate, which was a bit of a weak spot. He'd managed to close the Westport against the Jacobite approach along what would now be Argyll Street, and there were walled enclosures which protected the approaches to some of the housing areas. So it was all about defending these pinch points and hopefully preventing the Jacobites from penetrating too deep into the city. Perhaps Argyll could inflict enough casualties on the approaching Jacobites to make them pull back in the interests of their longer campaign aims. Now, Western Glasgow might have presented a challenge for any commander, but Tullibardine had a confident force, largely made up of the victors of 9 Mile Bridge, Clooney Macpherson's men, and a battalion of the Athol Brigade. They'd also been reinforced by Glenbucket's small regiment. Tullibardine divided his larger regiments into 2 sections and then split his whole army into 3 prongs to attack from 3 different directions, hoping to overstretch the militiamen defending the city. He determined he would attack first at the Westport, where he would charge straight towards the Trongate. Another thrust would go through the churchyard at St David's on the northern side of the battlefield, and a further thrust would hit the weak point at the Watergate along the riverside. No sooner had Tullibardine given these instructions, however, than his men seemed to become somewhat overawed by the scale of the task in front of them. Tullibardine, of course, couldn't be everywhere himself, and the further his men moved from his own position, the more likely they were to stall in their approach. The Macphersons, advancing towards St David's Church, had a particularly tardy approach. And that delay was to prove extremely costly, because it allowed the Glasgow militia within the city to redeploy in response to the threat. They got into the churchyard walls and put some terrible fire into the approaching Macphersons, disordering them and leaving them stuck in front of the walls under heavy musketry. Meanwhile, Tullibardine himself had more luck leading the Glenbuckets towards the Westport. They carried petards, and once the Glasgow militia had spotted this, they pulled back from the gate, fearing the collateral damage from any potential explosion. And with a very successful dice roll, the Glenbuckets successfully blew the Westport and surged through the wreckage of the gate and smashed into the Glasgow militia beyond. They successfully won the combat there, driving the militiamen back into the city, but now stalled themselves. They came under increasing fire from the areas around the streets and were disordered and left to take heavy casualties from the musket fire. Up at St David's, meanwhile, the Macphersons had finally closed up and engaged in a bitter hand-to-hand struggle across the churchyard walls. This was a very stubborn resistance put up by the Glasgow militia, who it had been expected would break pretty quickly under the weight of this assault. Instead, Jacobite casualties continued to mount, and the Glasgow militia held on long enough that they might just be able to inflict some severe damage on the Jacobites elsewhere. But the Jacobite advantage in numbers meant that the garrison was simply stretched too thin. The Athol men were able to get through the Watergate barricades and then into the town. They engaged with the Argyll militia in the buildings around that side of the Stockwell Street and Bridgegate, but eventually were able to drive the Argyll men off, dispersing them, and then allowing the Athol men to advance in support of the Glenbuckets, who'd been struggling to force their way up Trongate. At St David's, the Glasgow militia successfully routed one of the 2 Macpherson units before eventually succumbing themselves. The Macphersons were able to surge into the city, come through past the Shorefield mansion, and take a position that threatened the flank of the remaining militia sections that were trying to hold Trongate. Facing withering fire from 3 different directions, eventually Argyll and his men were obliged to surrender with heavy casualties. The Jacobites' success, however, had been hard fought. Fortunately, Tullibardine had been able to rally off some of the casualties amongst the Glenbuckets, so none of the Jacobite units ended the battle shaken, but one whole half of Macpherson's regiment had been routed, and that unit will now fight the rest of the campaign as one of the smaller regiments in the Jacobite army. In fact, the stubbornness of the resistance offered by the Glasgow militia and the number of casualties taken in the engagement is pretty certain to make sure that resentment against the Jacobite occupation will continue here. So whilst the Jacobites may have taken the town, and whilst they may have dispersed the threat from Argyll's militias, they haven't done anything to improve the relationship between the Glasgow citizenry and the prince's cause. Nevertheless, Tullibardin's victory at Glasgow has secured the flank of the prince's main army whilst it continues to lay siege to Stirling Castle. In fact, the campaign map would be looking pretty positive for the Jacobite army at this point if it weren't for the fact that there had been some other very significant developments. Essentially, the British army had decided to trade space in Scotland for time in England, and whilst the Jacobites had been busy consolidating around Scotland, the British army had been assembling a large force at Doncaster under Marshal Wade. Marching in 3 columns, this force has now advanced as far as Newcastle, where it's linked up with the survivors from the Battle of Prestonpans, the garrison of Berwick, and the garrison, of course, of Newcastle itself. There is now a very substantial force poised to threaten Prince Charlie's position as he lays siege to Stirling Castle. The siege works at Stirling have been completed, and the batteries have opened fire after the second refusal of that garrison to surrender. Now Prince Charlie's got a pretty difficult choice on his hands. He knows that a large force has assembled at Newcastle, although exactly how large he's unsure. He has, however, summoned Lord Lewis Gordon to bring his Lowlanders down from Aberdeen to link up with him. He now has to decide whether it is worth holding his position at Stirling in the hope that the castle will fall before Marshal Wade can do anything to relieve it, assuming that Marshal Wade chooses to bring his army north. Or will Charles Edward and the Jacobite Council decide that now is the time to make a dash towards the border before Marshal Wade's forces can get any stronger? It's the end of October. Winter is coming, the weather is already starting to turn, and the campaign seems to be reaching its most critical phase yet. So there's clearly much more to come in the coming weeks, so be sure to follow us on our website, on our Facebook page, and of course in a few weeks' time when we release our next video blog. Thanks for watching.